And hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. And today we have, my name's John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET Community team. Welcoming back Damian Edwards. Welcome, Damian.
Hi.
And hello, and Stephen Halter.
Hi, and I go by Stefan. So
Stefan, damn it.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
I almost put like the pronunciation guide in the little icon at the bottom.
John's going to add to his presenter notes now. Before we
That's
start
right.
the call, always confirm pronunciation of people's names before we start.
Wonderful. All right. Well, and so Stefan, you've been working on a lot of cool stuff. We were chatting before this. You've worked on SignalR and Kestrel, and then lately you've been working on these minimal APIs.
Yeah, so I'm super excited. Damian's got a playground that he's ready to share, showing off this new host and this new way of defining endpoints in ASP.NET. So
awesome.
Oh, nice.
Okay, well,
we will. Korea. Hi.
Well, we will. It's always fun to see people joining from all around the world. So cool. We will start as we do with the community links. I've just shared them out in the chat. I have them on a banner. All right, let's do this. So here we go. Starting with, this is a nice one. So Marinko talking about middleware. And I like just kind of the flow kind of going through and explaining what is middleware, how does it work, building up and talking about, and this one kind of focuses a little more on the conditional middleware approach. So showing, here's the standard middleware you get, here's how to create some middleware. Then as we go through, showing the use method, so the kind of simplest case, and then showing this whole kind of idea of using map and map when for branching. So, cases where you've got multiple things going on, and in this case, first showing just with use run, both mapped, and then showing the case where you want to do map when, and routing that to a specific query. So then, of course, things get cluttered as you keep adding more and more in. And so it's time to move things to different files, and then showing, pulling those in from a factory. So this is just kind of a nice, if you've used middleware in the past and haven't, kind of looked at how to build your own middleware or how to kind of hook it all together, this is kind of a nice walkthrough there.
It's good to get back to the basics sometimes and really nail those things. Yeah.
And, I try to balance it, not, cover, we could have ones on middleware every other week or something.
Yeah.
But I like this kind of building up from the basics. And we forget, that there are people that are coming new to ASP.NET Core all the time. And, this is an important concept to get. So.
Right.
All right. Speaking of kind of the learning, learning things new and figuring out where to go. So Moyen has been updating this roadmap over time. And this is just really cool. This is a, what are the different skills? Where do you get started? What do you learn next? That sort of thing. So, of course, it's opinionated, but that's great. That's the idea here, is just kind of like figuring out, here's where you get started and what to learn next. So all sorts of different, patterns and libraries and things like that. And, of course, keep learning when you get done. And then a bunch of resources afterwards. So very good stuff. This is neat, just looking at minimal APIs. So DoDG has a repo, practical ASP.NET Core. And these are always things where he's constantly updating these. They're very lightweight patterns. And so very simple, focused, targeted scenarios. So here he's updated one, and this is a single file, and just updating this to, to build using the minimal APIs. So I wanted to share this. First of all, this is topical to what we're talking about, but just a reminder to people, this practical ASP.NET Core has been updated for years, and all these very targeted scenarios. So as you're learning concepts, these are helpful. And then it's also to see how, for instance, I don't know if we'll just pick a random one, and then I'll go with, say this one here. And you can see in the history where these just keep getting updated. Well, of course, I pick one that's only vetted for a few. But he continually updates these through all the different releases. So wonderful stuff. We've got .NET Conf is announced. Calls for speakers is open. So get your presentations in. There is, as we always do, there is a round the world day where we go a whole 24 hours around the world, 30-minute sessions. This is a great time for people. We have an international audience, so all our friends joining us from around the world, this is a great time to speak and get a lot of viewers, and it's a very friendly audience, and so great opportunity to get your presentations in. All right, just a few more. This is a neat one. Claire tweeted about this yesterday. So this is in NuGet.org. There's a link to open in NuGet Package Explorer. So this is online. So for instance, here, I just went to, if you go, I'll just show that it's like if I go to NuGet.org, and then if I just click on a package, so here we'll do, I don't know, mock. And then if I click and open in NuGet Package Explorer, so this is something I always like to see. What am I installing? I like to look at the source code. And so this is all done online. Opens pretty quickly. And then you can explore through. Yeah, isn't this neat? So you can see like what's in. Yeah. So it has viewers for the different things. And so great to be able to just kind of understand what are you getting in the package. I use NuGet Package Explorer extensively. I install it from the Windows Store, where Claire's been maintaining it in there for a while now. But I guess the fact that it's in browser now means it works cross-plat. It's the same functionality no matter where it is. Do we know what it's built with? Like, how have they made it work in the browser like that? Did they port it from whatever it was to like something that begins with B? I think so. It's also possible that it was done with Uno, because I've seen something with Uno WebAssembly. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we could view source, right? Yeah, it's the web. Right clicking is not working. Java applet? What? No, I'm just kidding. What is it? Control-Shift-I. Here we go. Console, network, sources. Yeah, it's Uno. Look at that. That's seriously cool. It's super cool. Yeah. So, and I mean, yeah, you saw how quickly it opened for relatively large things. And so it's just, that's seriously cool. It's if you haven't used Package Explorer, like do it like more. Like I use it because I often I'm debugging like the packages I'm building. And so I want to look at like, well, where did that thing go? Or I'm trying to figure out, well, what folder did an assembly come from or something if I hit something. But as you point out, John, it's actually incredibly useful just to, before you consume a package for the first time, or even if you update a package version, it's probably worth the 2 minutes just to go and have a look at the package. So you're a little more aware of what the package is bringing in. Because NuGet packages are so powerful, we often just think of them bringing in on like a DLL, right, that you reference, but they can bring in MS build logic, and they run as you, right? So they can do anything that you can do on your computer as soon as you bring them in. And so it's probably just good practice to, every time you update a package or add a new one, just go and have a quick check of what's in there. And like some of them can include JavaScript or content, and so like this one from this Jimmy Bogard, I don't know I don't trust that guy at all. So I'm gonna want to look and see what he's sneaking in. That one probably like adds some backdoor that controls your smoker. Exactly. So it ruins all your meats. So, and it's neat too. You can even view, like the images and all so. And you'll see on the left also some of the stuff to do with the, what are they calling it? Health? Is that what it says? Yeah. So like the ticks and the verifications of the repository signature, or if there's an Authenticode back signature, whether it was a deterministic build that produced it so that you can be confident that you could go to the source repo and build from that commit and you would get the exact same output, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all part of this kind of secure supply chain, and like understanding where your dependencies come from, et cetera. So it's a lot of really good info here. Yeah. This is super slick. Really. Do you know if this is open source? NuGet Package Manager is open source. I'm 99% sure. I don't know about the website. Maybe that is too. I'm not sure. That's cool. Like I'm already like looking at, our latest SignalR release JavaScript out of like,
NuGet back from, I should say, the full framework signaler when we shipped the JavaScript on NuGet.
Yep.
One feature I'd love to add, and I would maybe look into doing it if it is open source, is downloading like individual DLLs. I don't think you can do that. I was trying.
Well, I think in the desktop one that I use, you absolutely can, because you can just like right mouse click, I think, and say like copy this. But I don't know if you try it, John. Can you right mouse click on something in that lib folder and just like, or can you just like pick up one of the files and like drag it?
Sure, let's give it a shot.
Oh, I haven't tried dragging, but yeah, that's what I typically do with the Windows Store version.
Okay, so no, I couldn't download it. However, when I clicked on the DLL, look at all this information. It's giving attributes like PDB sources, I guess, if it's got source link.
It gives you a lot of good info. Like it'll extract all the assembly metadata, basically. So anything that can be observed in the assembly by loading it in a metadata context, it'll show that for you, which is great.
Oh, look at this, dependencies. So up in the upper left, I picked dependencies.
Oh, and they're navigable.
Yeah.
Is this the website?
Yeah.
Or does it go to NuGet? Is it downloaded again?
Wonderful.
That's cool. I like that.
All right, let's see what's in here. That's what we're doing the rest of the show. We're just gonna go through. Look at this, PDB sources. What?
That is cool.
And yeah, links directly over to GitHub. That's just some crazy stuff.
That's sweet. All
right. Okay, last one, which is also a visualization thing. This is from GitHub. This is the Office of the CTO, GitHub Octo. I like how they do that. And they've created this thing that's a visualizer for repositories. So here they show going through all these different repositories, and it dynamically generates this stuff. So this is pretty slick. The first thing I did after looking at this for a while, and they go through and show all these different cool repositories, and then they talk about also some future ideas of things that you could do as far as showing connections in a repository and kind of like navigating through it. So that was neat. I went over and checked out the ASP.NET and .NET repos, and they did not have color coding set up for .cs files. So I pinged them, and they added in .cs file visualization.
Nice.
Also. So now they did explain, like it still is not going to color in as you go in, unless you go at kind of deep levels. They only do certain levels of them, but they've added in a lot of others, like new spec and all sorts of other file types. So you can go up here and you can type in, whatever runtime, and it takes a little bit, it's got to go and fetch and analyze the data. But it's pretty slick, and you can link directly to it as well. So the Office of the CTO at GitHub, they're doing a lot of cool like visualization and data exploration stuff. And so I've followed them on Twitter, and I've been just kind of keeping an eye on what they're doing. So anyways, neat stuff. And then again, I guess we'll wait on that. So yeah, here's the Uno platform that I mentioned earlier. Somebody asked again about that. So there that is. And I am done talking. I'm ready to learn some more minimal API stuff.
Right. Well, I guess I'll give a quick background of what we mean when we keep talking about these minimal APIs in .NET 6 in ASP.NET Core, because the name has gone through a couple of iterations on what it covers and whatnot. And I think it's kind of settling down now based on how people have interpreted what we call it and how we refer to it in blog posts and whatnot. Today is a release day. We're in the middle of pushing a new release right now. So the stuff that I'm talking about will be a combination of stuff we've shown in Preview 6, stuff that comes out today in Preview 7, and then stuff in daily builds, because obviously I work mostly in daily builds, and as does Stefan, obviously, because he's writing the code and I'm consuming it usually, and then giving feedback, and we're iterating. So first of all, if you want to play along with this thing, you may have to consume bits that are a bit newer than the official previews sometimes. And the different people will decide whether they're ready to consume those bits as new as that or not. But the minimal API effort started, as I understand it, last year between Maria, who's a PM on our team, and Fowler, who's lurking in the comments today on YouTube. And it was initially, as I understand it, and I want Fowler to correct me if I'm wrong, an effort to investigate what would it mean to try and simplify the code involved with starting from zero, like a blank CS file, to getting your first hello world in an ASP.NET Core app. If we could somehow simplify that, because doing that today for people who are new to .NET or new to C#, there's a lot of concepts, right? C# is about to release version 10. We've had all these amazing features added to the language over a whole bunch of years, and very little, if anything, or nothing has been deprecated, right? Like you can do it, we might add new ways of doing things in C#, but often you can still do it the old way as well. And so as a result, the same is true for APIs that we build and ship. And so if we look at .NET Core and ASP.NET Core in particular, folks who have been with us over this last 5 or 6 years probably recall we've gone through a few different iterations of the type of code required to boot your application and configure the application, all the way from 1.0, where it was a lot of code. Like you would do file new in the templates, and our philosophy at that point was you can see everything that's happening. There's like 20 lines required to get hello world with what we think are the right default sort of idioms and configuration, like reading config from a settings file, reading config from the environment variable, reading config from the command line. If you wanted all that to be on by default, you had to call 3 methods to do that. And the first iteration of the templates did that. Back in the day. And so there was a lot of stuff to get from nothing to kind of hello. And as Fowler says, the good old days, sounding like a boomer. But in version 2, there was an effort to, after we shipped the version 1, we were like, a lot of this seems like boilerplate. Maybe we should be a little more opinionated as a product team about what we think represents a decent set of defaults, so that you don't have to have 40 or 50 lines of code to get what we think those defaults could be. And perhaps you don't have to reference 8 or 9 or even 10 different packages to get those defaults. Internally, the system we thought was very well layered. It's architected well. A lot of effort was put into ensuring that the actual DLLs and the APIs are factored in a way that we can improve the platform over time, and by ensuring things live in the correct layers and we don't introduce problems with circular dependencies and that type of thing. And also that your app doesn't have to take dependencies on lots of things to do whatever it is your app does. Like pay as you go was one of our philosophies early on, right? So you wouldn't have to have stuff if you didn't use it. Is this live? What can I do to prove it's live? I am drinking a cup of tea I just made and it's still hot. It is very much live. I could hit the reset button on my computer, but that would probably be a little too dramatic. So in version 2,
mispronounce someone's name live.
What's that?
I can mispronounce someone's name live on there. Damian.
So we would usually fix that in post. You're right.
Yes.
So in version 2, we introduced the concept of a static web host builder factory thing. Like basically, you would go webhost.create default. And instead of saying web host builder new web host builder dot add a bunch of stuff dot build dot blah 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 dot run, you could just say, hey, give me a builder that has the defaults that you think are right. And 40 lines went down to effectively 3 or 4. And so we did that in version 2, and then also in version 2 we kind of did some experiments with how we reference NuGet packages, and we introduced this idea of like a super meta package that represented a shared framework, which was new in .NET Core 2. And that was a bit of an abomination, and that went through iterations in 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2 before that finally got resolved the way we ultimately wanted to in version 3, with shared frameworks with ref packs and runtime packs and all these new concepts that got introduced into NuGet and MS Build and the SDK, et cetera, et cetera. So everything got a lot cleaner. So there's been this cycle of iterating and trying to identify places where there's a lot of boilerplate or even some boilerplate to achieve what we think is a reasonable kind of 80% case. There'll always be advanced cases where people need lower level access to things, but for the majority case, can we make those things easier? And so that includes APIs, and it includes sort of package structure and just the developer user experience. And so then in .NET 5, we went a step for .NET 3. When did we do generic host? That was 3, right? So .NET 3, we also we took the learnings of the web host that we did in 2 and the foundations of that in 1, and we genericized it. So instead of saying all this hosting goodness that gives you DI and configuration and logging and everything in one place, in a single composition route for your app, let's make that generic so that it's not just for web apps. We could, in theory, use it for any type of app. And we introduced the worker template in .NET Core 3, which utilized this new generic host. And so we went from like webhost.create to host.create, because now it's generic. You don't have the word web in front of it. And then we did some glue to kind of bridge the web host world to the host world. And that survived in .NET 5. And it was fine. It's pretty good. And it gives you a lot of power and flexibility. But if you look at it, there's still a little bit of legacy because of this kind of split between the generic hosting layer and then the web host specific things, like the support for a startup class, or extension methods that you want to appear on the builder that are web specific. So if you look at a template for a 3.0 app, maybe I'll share my screen now.
Sure.
Yeah. So let me. I've got a few things going on here, but if I go in here and I say, what version am I using in here? All right, so I'm using a bunch. So let's look at all the SDKs I've got. I do have a 3 SDK here. So what I'll do is I'll make a 3.x folder. Then I'll drop a global JSON in there. And there's nothing because I misspelt it. And then I'll edit that global JSON file. And I'll say, yeah, I want this to be 3.1. Whatever that was. So we scroll back up. 3.1.411. Okay. So now if I come back down here and I do version, we're now using 3.1.4.1. So if I create a new app in here, .NET new web, we'll just do the empty app and I'll put that in my web 1. And then I do code web 1. So we can see here, loading. We'll open up, there's my program CS, right? And I'll zoom in a bit for you, because I know you like that, John.
Yep.
We've got this kind of, this setup in our program main, okay? We've got main is obviously the normal entry method of a C# console app, basically. And we call out to this sort of weird hanging static method, which we'll get to a little bit in the future. Create host builder, which takes in the args as well. And then this is where we've got that host dot I talked about. So you got host.create default builder, which is the generic host that we introduced in 3. And then I'm zooming in a bit more because someone said zoom in. Yeah. And then we've got this configure web host defaults, which you receive a web builder. So you've got kind of a host builder within a host builder in 3x and 5.0. And that was just kind of due to this evolution that we went through. And so then you finally get down to like, here's my web specific stuff. And then that just effectively shells out to a different class, which is your startup class, right? Which everyone kind of knows and loves. All right, so that was 3. If we go back and I do the same, I think in 5x, we didn't change anything, Stefan, did we? That was basically the same in 5.
No, it's basically the same template in 5. And yeah, for people who are curious, like the generic host is so you can host like Windows services and stuff like alongside your web application. So
right,
kind of
so
like
the worker
reason
template
for layering.
we introduced, right?
Yep.
But in fact, if I look at, go back into my 3 folder and I do .NET new worker -- help, there's that worker template, the details about that worker template that I talked about in that. And if I go ahead and create one of those, we can see how that works. So if I do worker 1, I do code for worker 1, and we open that one up, we'll see a very similar thing. So here it is. This is now not my web app. This is a worker app, which, as Stefan just said, I typically run as a Windows service or maybe a standalone container in a Kubernetes cluster, or it's deploy it to a Linux machine and run it using some type of daemon service like systemd. But you can see it looks very similar, the boot up code to my web application code. In fact, the only where it starts to differ is down here. All this stuff is the same because it's the same hosting pattern. And then we go, oh, but we don't have startup classes in generic hosts. We have a different pattern for kind of booting the app. And in this case, you add a hosted service, and you tell it, yeah, there's my worker class. And in this case, this is kind of the app model for a worker. You have a thing that implements an interface or derives from this background service abstract class, and then you override some things, and that's the app model. Like that's what you do, right? And web apps obviously are far more rich and they have a lot more features because it's a web app. So that gets us, through the history of effectively of the startup stuff. Fast forward back to what I started talking about, which was last year. There was an experiment run by Fowler and Maria to look at what would it mean to create a simpler startup experience for folks who want to build web apps or APIs who perhaps are familiar with other ecosystems, whether it be JavaScript or Go or Python, but you wanted them to be able to do it in C#. And so Fowler wrote a library called Feather HTTP. So if I Google Feather HTTP, you can see that here's the repo. And this was the foundation of that experiment and that user study. So they actually got people into a lab remotely because COVID, and they got them to run through a tutorial. And then they observed how they went, and they asked them questions at the end, and they did the usual kind of user study thing. And so you can see this might look familiar now. Here's this hello world using Feather HTTP, right? Which looks much simpler. So there's a few things going on here already that we can break down. So before I even get into the APIs, this looks very different to a C# program.cs file that we might be used to. And that's because it's utilizing top-level statements, which was a feature that was introduced in C# 9, I want to say. So the last version of C# in .NET 5. And that basically allows you to have the primary entry file for your application, typically program.cs historically, doesn't need to declare the class and the entry method, the main anymore. If you have a top-level statements file, it's basically found by the compiler by default, and that will be assumed to be the equivalent of your program main, okay? And so that simplifies a whole bunch of things. You don't have to declare a namespace, which is always optional, but a class and then have a method on it. You just say, nah, here's my code. Simple as that, right? And so you can see here, these are just statements. These are just C# statements. They're not in a class. They're not in anything else. And up here, we have the more typical usings that you would see at the top of any .cs file. So we've made an evolution. We've got to here. And as a result of that experiment, it turned out, this idea has some legs. Looking to remove certain boilerplate does improve the experience that new users to the platform might have, because it drastically reduces the amount of concepts that people need to be exposed to get from I've got the SDK running to I'm now seeing output from an application for the first time, right? Without having to ignore a bunch of code.
I just want to mention, as you're pointing out those top-level statements and stuff, I was hosting Mads Christensen on a show, and he was writing a Visual Studio extension, and we started playing with that, and we just turned on the latest language version in the CS Proj and refactored, and it worked with, there's tons of boilerplate code and all kinds of usings and all this stuff. We moved all the usings to global. We did just refactored. And these huge, long, verbose methods all of a sudden were 5 lines of code, It's really pretty. So you don't have to, you can, depending on your use cases or whatever, but you can start using this stuff now and refactor your code quite a bit.
Yeah. And so, it's fair to say, I will say, when you say now, I think the iteration we're about to talk about, .NET 6 is where a lot of this stuff really comes together.
True.
We didn't update our templates, for example, in .NET 5 to use top-level statements, despite it being supported by the language, okay? If Fowler is asking me to zoom in, which one, Fowler? This is zoomed in quite a lot already.
Got
I
quite
can
a
zoom
bit
in
going on.
more.
So I can disappear.
I can zoom in the console more. There we go. Just hide our faces. That's easier.
Yeah.
So let's go to 6 now. So we've seen what, this is kind of what we could have done in 5 in terms of top level statements, but this was an experiment. So what did we do to take the results of that experiment plus more features that are introduced in C# 10, aka .NET 6, to simplify this yet even more. So if I look at, I'm in my 6x folder now. So let's just make sure I'm using the 6x version. I am. Excellent. So let's go in here and we'll do .NET New Web, Web 1 in this folder. Okay, and then I'll open up that in VS Code, and then we can see what this looks like now. Boom, right? Look at that. So it's even less code than we had in the Feather experiment, because something you alluded to now, the code is too big now. We need to zoom back out.
Where are all the usings?
That you alluded to was global usings, right? So global usings is a feature of C# 10, which enables you to, in C# anywhere, you can define a using as being global for that project. So instead of just saying using blah, you can say global using blah. But we don't have any usings here, so how is that working? Well, we took the global usings feature and then we built an SDK level feature, an MS build feature, effectively, that's implemented in the SDK that we call implicit usings. And it uses the C# 10 global usings feature to let you define global usings in MS build. So they become implicit to your code because they're not in your code. They just get added by the SDK or by your own MS build files that are interpreted by the SDK. And then by default in .NET 6 for new projects created, we do this. We just imply that you are going to use a certain amount of global usings. So all of those usings that we saw in this example here, they're on by default. You get those in every CS file in an ASP.NET Core 6 app by default if you create a new project. Now, in a little caveat here, in Preview 7, the release going out today, that's only guarded by does your project target .NET 6. So if you take an existing project and you change the TFM in the project file, so I go to my project file and I set this to .NET 6.0 like it is here, then I just get the usings, right? Like, so that early feedback on that was that can cause some issues for existing projects. So in the next release, which is already being worked on now, that will be behind a flag that looks like this. So new projects will actually have this property that says implicit usings enable, and that's what will turn them on, rather than automatically turning them on based on TFM. So if you upgrade an existing project to .NET 6 and you want the implicit usings, you'll have to also add this property to get them. Okay, so that's just something I wanted to say there.
So,
and that's why this is. Can that break stuff? Potentially. It can, potentially, and in reality, it did break a couple of things in some very complicated repos when we tried it out internally, like the .NET repo and the ASP.NET Core repo. And the usual way in that it can break is with type conflicts. And so if you have two classes or two types in the universe of things that you depend on or reference in your project that have the exact same class name, and then you import both namespaces, you'll get a type conflict because the compiler doesn't know if you meant task from system.threading, blah, 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 or if you meant task from msbuild, blah, 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 if you reference both. And the way to work around that is you can use an alias, right? So using supports aliases now. You can say using foobar is equal to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core, whatever. I can say, hey, that now is that thing, right? Or you can also do it for a specific type. So you can bring in, you can alias a specific type that way as well. So now I can refer to this using this and just change it completely, and I can break the conflict that way. Okay, so now it's no longer a conflict. So that's how you can work around that if you hit that issue.
Someone asked in the chat, can you add your own implicit usings or global usings?
Yes, you can. And so because this is an SDK feature, once you've opted into implicit usings like this, and in fact, you don't even need to opt into implicit usings because they're not treated as implicit if you specify them explicitly in a MS Build file. you can, in an item group, and again, this is going to be the case in the next release, not the release that's out today, because we've made some adjustments to this, is you can define them using a using item like this, okay? And then you'll say include. If I wanted to include everything in the ASP.NET Core.mvc namespace, which is complete overkill, but say I wanted to do that, you could do that, and now that namespace is automatically included in every CS file, because that will emit a global using inside a generated CS file that you'll see, that the compiler will see, but is not in your source code. Okay.
Right. And you can do that in a NuGet package. And if it's just your own project, you can use the C# feature as well and just put it in a separate file.
That's right. So you can, if you just have one project and you just want to do this in one project, you can choose, like, just put it in a .cs file called whatever you like, global usings.cs if you want, and the compiler will find them. But if you want to compose them via MS Build, so that, you know, put them in a directory .build.props, or as Stefan said, put them in a NuGet package so that when someone adds your package, they get a using. I'd recommend that you guard that with an MS Build property. They have to opt into, similar to what we're doing if you do that. Or you want to modify an existing one, this is an MS Build item. So you can modify it and change it, compose it with other ones using all the normal MS Build idioms. So I can change this to, you know, update, and I can change this to remove, and I can do all the, I can put a condition on this, right? I can do, you know, condition equals and do an MS Build expression here so that it only applies in certain conditions. Someone asked a great question. Does it support stars? Oh, I wish it would. That requires a language feature. And I very, very much would love the ability to be able to do that and have the compiler understand that, right? But that's not the case today. It is something that's been talked about before. And it's a reminder to me and to go and potentially chase up the language team to suggest that and see if that could land. So yes, that will be possible in the next release.
Okay. Similar question on folder scoped, and I'd assume that's the same too, right?
On which one? Sorry.
I think this is the same thing as basically globbing.
There's file no. So there is no support for folder scope usings. There is something called a file scoped namespace declaration, which is a little bit different, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the CS language still doesn't have support for scoping based on directory structure. It did come up in the language design meetings, I believe, for these features, but I looked at some of the notes. And the pushback on it, as I understand it, was that today the compiler doesn't do anything with regards to paths or the file system. Like it doesn't understand where files are. There's no ordering implications in CS. There's no depth implications with regards to where the file came from in the file system. And that's somewhat a principle, and they don't want to introduce that in the compiler. We do it in Razor, as the user pointed out, so that in Razor, we'll actually automatically infer namespace from the folder, and the tooling does it today. If you create a folder and then you add a file, the template will set the namespace for that file to be based on the folder path, but the compiler itself doesn't do that. So that's where we're at with that. Just quickly, to finish off the feature of using that's coming as well, you'll also be able to specify an alias in here. So you could, for example, as I did before, you could do the same thing by doing that, and now that will be available everywhere in every file in your project. Foobar will resolve to MVC. The other thing you can do is do static usings. So you could, for example, change one of our new types that's been introduced. You could fully qualify or quickly qualify results to point at that, and that would bring that in without you having to specify. Sorry, that should be this way. That would then allow you to say the methods on the results class, which is static, are now always available, and I don't have to identify them or resolve them using the type name. Okay, so that is equivalent to those who haven't seen that before. That's equivalent to doing this. Which now makes every static method or every static member on this type available in this scope. Right, so I could just say JSON and it shows up because it's a method on results. Okay, so we have full support for all styles of using statements with regards to importing things into your language scope in the next version. of the SDK.
Real quick question, and like, just because we do have some beginners watching, what is the like elevator pitch? What is the high level on what people need to know about MS Build?
Right. So that's a good question. So because .NET is a compiled language, I should say, sorry, C# is a compiled language, and .NET is a type-safe system that runs on something called intermediate language, right? You typically write your source code in a language like C# or F# or Visual Basic, and then you run it through a tool chain to produce IL, or intermediate language. That's what the .NET runtime knows how to execute. That's different to something like Node, where you write JavaScript and it executes JavaScript. Now, you could write TypeScript, right? And then you'd run it on Node. You would have to run that through a compiler. So you start with TypeScript, it emits JavaScript, and then you run JavaScript as in Node. In .NET, in this case, type C#. You run it through a compiler, it emits intermediate language, or IL, and then that runs on the runtime. That middle step where you're running it through a tool chain, and as Fowler says, don't learn MS Build until you need to. That middle step where you're running it through a tool chain, there is a standalone C# compiler. It's an executable. It's csc.exe. But you don't ever really use that directly. What you use directly is the .NET CLI. So you say like .NET build, right? So you come out here and you would say, .NET build something. Under the covers, that is invoking a tool chain, which is coordinated by MS Build. MS Build is the build system that .NET uses by default. There are other ones, but the MS Build is the one that we ship and that is used by default. And so think
of it like make with XML.
And it's XML, right? For reasons, for historical reasons. It's been around for over 20 years. And it's also the file format that our IDEs understand. Like here I'm using Visual Studio Code with OmniSharp running, and it knows how to interpret these CS proj files and these MS Build files, as does Visual Studio. You open a .NET project. A .NET project is an MS Build file. So it is kind of the unit of structure, and it's the unit of building and build orchestration. In Node, you'll see scripts being used for this. So you'll have like a packages JSON script where you define all of your references to dependencies on npm packages, but you can also put tasks in that file, and then you can use npm to execute those tasks. So you can kind of think of it that way. But yeah, that's all MS Build is. You typically don't have to get familiar with MS Build, as Fowler said, as part of being a normal .NET dev until you get into more advanced scenarios.
Cool.
All right, so staying in this template now, we can see it's really simple, right? We have this web application.create builder, which returns a builder similar to before. At this stage in here, I can do stuff to configure the builder before I run build. The most common thing you would do is add services to the DI container, right? And so if we think back to the 3x application and the 5x, where we had a startup class where we would traditionally be configuring our services and then setting up our middleware pipeline, to now you would do that here. So you would configure your services in here. You might also configure the configuration providers in here. And then after you call build, you get back an app. And the app is the thing that you configure your middleware on. So here I'm doing a map get, which is an example of one of the new minimal APIs that we added in .NET 6 that says, hey, when you get a request for /, can you run this delegate here? And this delegate is a anonymous Lambda.
So you say map get is new. I think I've seen that method before.
So this is a new overload. Map get has been around since .NET Core 2.1, because I think I wrote the original version of it. And I had to fight Fowler to get it in. He didn't want it. But we've come a long way. And so this is a new overload that knows how to take a standard delegate that has no type information on it whatsoever, other than the fact it returns a string, and turn that into the underlying delegate type that the ASP.NET Core pipeline understands. We call it the request delegate. And that's a specific signature that is used, that all middleware has to implement, which basically means it has to take the same parameters and it has to return the same values. And that's what we build up the middleware pipeline with. So now we have a lot more support for taking delegates with different shapes and basically turning them into a request delegate under the scene, under the covers, and then plugging them into the middleware pipeline. And that's what Stefan's been working so hard on this release, is this whole mechanism for not only this part, which is let's simplify and create minimal versions of the boot up logic, but let's also create basically a minimal framework for mapping endpoints to routes in ASP.NET language, right? So you can think of this as a route. This is a route pattern, effectively. It actually is. It is exactly what this gets used for. And then this is an endpoint delegate or a minimal action, or we've given it a few different names. This is the code that runs. Yeah, a route handler. You could give it different names.
So geek out a little bit about
that. Yep. Sorry, I have a short question on this.
Yeah.
I get what that is because I've seen the code and I understand there's this delegate and all that kind of stuff. Is it ever possible to change that delegate syntax so you don't need that operator at the beginning?
So the question you're asking, if I understand, is that why do I have to do this at the beginning?
Yeah. And
so why can't I just do that, for example?
Exactly. And I'm cool with typing it, but I just wonder, you're teaching somebody new, is it possible?
You're not the first person to have to make that comment. Okay. Let me give you the same answer that I've given other people, and I've heard other people reply with as well. No one blinks an eyelid in JavaScript when the first thing you do is pass a delegate. They just don't call them delegates, right? They call them functions. You pass a Lambda function to some other function invocation in order to say, hey, run this when this thing happens. That is like JavaScript 101. If you're learning Express in Node, for example, doing a hello world, you will do that. In .NET, for some reason, we introduced Lambdas back in what? .NET 2? .NET 3? Someone tell me which version it was. It was a precursor to Link. You had to have them to support Link, right? Because you pass these to the Link extension methods. And so we've had them, I think, since .NET 2, which means they've been there since 2005. Right, Bob? That's correct. Since 2000. That's GA. They were in previews before that. Yet there is still in our community, including, and it's not just you, John. I'm saying people.
Yeah, I'm trying to speak on behalf of.
That's right.
Too, right.
And they're like, why do we have to do this? This seems like some ceremony. I don't know how to, this is so generic, a method that takes two strings. It's so constraining. We would never be able to add overloads of anything if we did this. A method that
that's the only problem.
Yeah.
But you're making me think we could do it, right? Okay, so right now we take the route as the first parameter, as Damian says, and then the second parameter used to take specifically what's called a request delegate, right? Which is a func of HB context to task. Now we take delegate, which, to geek out a little bit, this gets pretty intense. We couldn't do this before C#10 existed without a bunch of ugly casting. This
great point.
In the original template, this thing that returned to hello world, you had to explicitly cast that to a func of string. But now in C#10, there's this concept of a natural type for lambdas. Basically, it just means that C#10 figures it out, what you would really want to cast this thing to.
This thing is so hard to use. I can never get it right the first time.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. I see. Yeah. So you're trying to use an overload that takes the next parameter. I
need to do that, but I don't have to.
I don't think you do. That works for middleware, but for endpoints, since it's
is that what I should have done? No. How do I get the overload that takes request delegate?
Okay. Yeah. There's no next for request delegate. You just return the task directly. Middleware can take a next function. So yeah, and then you can just do context dot response dot write async whatever. And that will give you what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that is the functional equivalent of this, other than the path, right? And as Stefan just pointed out, it was not possible for us to support this until C# in C#10 added new language features with to do with how they infer signature delegate types from what you pass. If I hover over this, you'll see that the IntelliSense, the statement completion help here, is actually saying this method accepts delegate. Like it just accepts delegate. That's like any method basically can be passed to this, which means that you can also do stuff like this. I can pass what's called a method group. And I mean, these names all mean something, but it's just kind of like, so if I'll do a string, sorry. So if I turn a string and I call this hello world, right? And then from this, I do return hello world. That is now valid. So I created a local function, which is a C#9 feature, I believe.
Think so.
Local function inside my top level statements file. And then from that, I return a string. And then I pass that as a method group to here. And the compiler correctly can resolve a method group to a delegate, which it couldn't do before in the same. And then also can take an anonymous lambda and do the same thing as well, which is just awesome, because it means that we can now basically have a method that says, give me a pointer to any method. I don't care what it is. And then we will do our best to convert that into a request delegate. And if we can't, then we'll tell you we can't.
I guess what I was asking or thinking is that there could be an overload that just takes a string and wraps it in a delegate, but
that's what Stefan was saying.
How useful that is. Because
it's possible, but as Stefan, as you just pointed out, how useful is that really? Because you're going to stop doing that like instantly once you've learned how to do it. And the second thing is, there are overload rules. We can only have so many methods called map-get. They all have to be different with regards to the parameters they accept. And there's like a whole bunch of complicated rules to do with overload resolution in C#. And so if we use the overload that is 2 parameters that accepts a string to do this, it kind of feels like a waste. There's probably a better use case of an overload of map-get that takes 2 strings that we'll land on in the future. And it's not this one, because as we just said, you'll stop using this instantly. Like, how many things are you just going to return a string from? So
right, yeah, that's fair. It was, and then we struggle. I was just before this, I was on another call, and we were like struggling with like, okay, you can make for a course for Blazor, and we're like, okay, we can make something super simple for Hello World, but then you immediately have to drop it and learn another concept, so it's a waste of your time, really.
So someone just asked, can you do this? Yeah, because we're combining a bunch of different language features here. And so I'll pause at this moment to say what this has enabled is that when we go on a learning journey with a new user and we develop some type of story arc, or we let the user drive the story arc, much like what we're doing here, we're responding to comments, you'll see how I think this is much more progressive. Like we're not having to see concepts introduced in the language or the framework until someone is ready, until they ask the question, or we're ready to tell them as the storyteller. So I can change that string literal that I had before into an interpolated string in the same method. And I can say, you put $1 in front of a string literal, it turns it into an interpolated string in C#. And then I can use the curly brace syntax to template the interpolated string and pass in whatever value I want to be inserted into the string. And that was a nice step from it was just a string to now it's an interpolated string. And
that's a good example for why having just a string overload might not be as convenient as you think. Because if it was a string overload, it wouldn't work the same. Like the time would always be the same for every request as opposed to the time of the request. So giving people that overload might actually cause problems down the road. Who knows?
And that's interesting. And that's really subtle, right? Because that gets to like lifetime and values and like delayed execution and all these type of things that can be difficult. And that's not just a C# thing. That absolutely would occur in JavaScript as well. Anything that can accept a method versus accepting a value. And then getting a mental map of, well, when does this code execute? Like I understand that line 8 is going to execute when the application starts and it executes before run, but this won't execute until a request to this comes along, right? And getting that mental model is incredibly important for a learner as they're learning how web application sort of object models work and application models work. So this code all runs at the beginning. This is where your app starts running. And then these little snippets are what runs when they match when requests match these route patterns that you passed in.
So, and since these all are the same route pattern, it's going to execute all three of those, right?
Well, exactly. This is invalid. What you'll get actually is an error when you try and run this application. I think is it when you run, Stefan, or is it when the first request comes in? I can't remember.
I think it's during the request. It will say that it can't find a single.
It'll say ambiguous or something.
Yeah, okay.
Because you can't. It'll say what you said, John. I've got three routes that match the incoming request. I don't know which one. I can't disambiguate that. So this is invalid. Typically, you would obviously have these as hello 1 and hello 2 and hello 3 or something like that, and then that would be fine.
Are we gonna have time to show parameters? I know we're running low.
So let me fast forward. All right.
Yeah. So we basically, our hard stop is in a half hour from now.
Okay.
Oh, good.
That's good. But that's a good reminder. So I'll a couple minutes to wrap this stage up, and then we'll go over to my other project, which is more fully fleshed, and we can talk about some of the parameter support and response report support that Stefan's talking about. So there's a lot of different language features that have come together here in this template that you'll see some of in Preview 7 and then some more of in RC1 when it comes out in another month or so from now. C# 8 features, C# 9 features, and C# 10 features all coming together to create this more minimal approach to building applications. One other one I wanted to point out that we're now opting into by default is this one. So in C# 8, we introduced the concept of nullable reference types in C#. And then it's been a bit of a journey for people to get their code updated. And when I say people, I mean us, to get ASP.NET Core and the .NET Runtime updated to actually use the nullable annotations to use this language feature to guard against one of the most frustrating errors that you can experience as a .NET developer, which is object reference not set to an instance of an object. And so we turn this on by default now in new projects. So we have nullable enabled in new projects that you create in .NET 6, and so that will introduce slight changes to some scenarios where the compiler is more strict, effectively, about the types that you can bring into parameters and what you can reference and dereference, and it'll give you warnings if you do things that could result potentially in a null reference error. And you fix those warnings by using new syntax to tell the compiler more information about, I expect this to be nullable. That's okay. Let me declare it with the question mark to say it's nullable. So that's also on in these new templates. Okay, so this was empty web. Obviously, this is where people start. Let's have a look at where you might end up going. So I have this playground repo where I've been experimenting with these features as they get built in the daily builds, and then also as a quasi set of examples of what the type of thing that you can do. Quickly, if you want to use these nightly builds I keep talking about, you can go to the .NET/installer repo on GitHub, and then if you scroll down in the README, if you're on Windows, this is the link you want right here, which gives you the Windows x64 installer for the main branch, which is the latest. And if you click on installer, it'll download the MSI. Usually Windows, the smart screen on Windows doesn't like it. You'll have to tell it, no, really trust this. It's fine. I know where it comes from. Yes, please run it, because it's not signed in the same way that our generally released bits are. But if you get through all those hurdles, you can install the same type of bits that I'm using here and get these really, really fresh, hot bits. All right. So minimal API playground on the Damian Edwards repo. What is in here? So if I go into source, I've got three folders here, or 3 projects. One is the playground, where I've just got a whole bunch of random stuff, including stuff that will probably never ship, some experiments, some things where I hide things away to make it look like it's in the framework, but it's not, And then a couple that are a little more pared down, a little more realistic. So for example, a to-do application that uses Dapper for data persistence. And you can see in here, it has one file. It has program.cs. The whole app is just one file. And if I open on that, you can see it's using a bunch of the stuff we talked about. I don't have any using statements for ASP.NET or for system or system.threading or any of the typical stuff. They're implied because I get those from the implicit usings feature. But then I've just imported the things that are unique to my program. So my usings is a lot more cleaner, right? So then you see your builder application like that we showed before. And then in this phase here, before I call build, I'm adding my types to the DI container so that they're available later on in the application. In this case, because I'm using Dapper, I just have to add the SQLite connection type, and then I use a factory here so that every time someone asks for a SQLite connection, I'll run this delegate and it'll just create a new SQLite connection using this connection string, which I've hard-coded in this case. And then once it's built, we'll ignore InsureDB. You see the typical type of stuff that you may have seen in your startup class before. But to Stefan's point now, you're going to see some more advanced examples of this. Hey, we can take any delegate now and we'll do some magic for you. So here's the two that we were playing around with before, right? Hello world. And this is an example of hello world that returns an object rather than returning a string. So here I'm returning what C# calls an anonymous type, right? It's like new object on the fly with a property called hello with a value of world. That's an anonymous type. And what we'll do for you now is anything that you return from one of these delegates that isn't iResult, which is a new type we'll talk about in a minute, just gets serialized as JSON by default. That's just what happens. That's an opinion. You can't change it. That is what you get if you pass a delegate to map get or map post or map put, map delete. And it's not something that we will otherwise process separately. It'll just get serialized to JSON. So that's our new sort of default scenario for these style of APIs. You can write more code to make it return something that you want explicitly. But if you just return an object, it will get serialized as JSON. So let's have a look at some slightly more advanced scenarios. So here's the first one, right? If I go to /todos, I want to return all the to-dos in my application. So here's my Lambda that I'm passing in as the delegate to run when this route is matched. But now it accepts a parameter, as Stefan was saying before. So where does this parameter value come from? Well, that's where some of the magic it now exists in our system. Or I should say the conventions that are based in the system that you can't change. The conventions that are there.
Well, you can use attributes, which I mean,
can use
the
attributes.
conventions work pretty well, so it's not here. But like attributes override any conventions, and that's also a new C# 10 feature. You didn't used to be able to have attributes in Lambdas. That's
a very good point. Thank you for pointing that out. So we have a convention by default, but you can override it through, I guess you could call it configuration, convention over configuration. So you can put some configuration on your parameters by decorating them with attributes, which you couldn't do before in Lambdas. Now you can, and then we'll use that to change where it comes from. So where is this going to come from by default? Well, the new feature in the DI container in .NET 6 enables us to know that SQLite connection is registered as a type, a resolvable type in the DI container. So because I ran this line up here that said, if someone asks for SQLite, please give them this, minimal APIs as a framework can go, oh, I know this is in the DI container, so I'm going to populate this DB parameter from the DI container. You just do that by default. It's very similar to how today in a controller, if you take this in a constructor parameter, by default, we populate that from the DI container, right? It's basically the same kind of thing, but we had to implement a new DI feature to get it to work in this scenario. So that's cool. That's the first type of parameter that you can take in. Let's scroll down until we see a method that looks a bit different. Here we go, line 31. We can see now that my route pattern includes a route parameter. That's the curly brace syntax here. I'm defining part of the path as being dynamic, basically. I want to bind to whatever appears after to-dos to a route parameter called ID, all right? So now I have a route parameter, and this route will only match if there's something to put in that route parameter. And then my method or my delegate takes in an extra parameter now, which matches. The names match, right? The parameter name here is ID. The route parameter name is ID. And so by default, the framework will bind those together for you. In this case, it's also declaring it as an int. So the framework will attempt to parse whatever you put into here as an int, right? Now, if it's not an int, Stefan, what happens?
Your method never gets called, and we'll return a 400, and we'll log an error, basically, saying that we weren't able to parse it.
Right. Can I use in the parameter? So where in the route pattern, could I say int : ID or something like that?
You could. So that's called a route constraint. Mm-hmm. And I will admit, I personally think route constraints I think what you might think would happen isn't what actually happens. It can be a little confusing to understand how routing and its rules join with the rules of whatever part of ASP.NET is involved in invoking your code. Because in MVC, there's kind of a set of rules, and in minimal APIs, there's a set of rules. In Razor pages, you can bind to query string and path stuff or wrap parameters in certain parts as well. There's a set of rules about what will happen. What Stefan just said is that the route will match. So it will go, okay, if I pass foo here, we'll say that matches, but then we'll look at the method and we'll go, yeah, but I can't turn foo into an int. So it'll automatically respond on your behalf and say this was a bad request because the value that you sent me I can't turn into an int. If I then do what John said and I say, let's put an int on this, then that gives extra information to the routing system. And then the routing system will make a decision about what to return, is my understanding off the top of my head, instead of minimal APIs being the thing that does that, right? So I think what happens if you put an int here is that it get registered as a route constraint, which means the route will still match, but the constraint will fail. And so then routing will return, I think, a 400. I think it actually returns the same thing. It returns a 400, but it does it for a slightly different reason. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah. Yep.
So cool. I can understand why perhaps people might think if you put an int here, like if I did id:'int to say that this should be only for ints, that then I could also have /todos /foo:*string, and then they would both be valid routes and like the right thing would happen, but it won't. Because they both have the same number of parameters and they're both prefixed with the same path. The routing system will actually say, well, it'll do something different based on whether the constraint applies or not, but it doesn't perhaps do what you think it might do. Where you could have a method that takes a string and one that takes an int, and you could declare the routes with int and string, and then they would kind of coexist. It doesn't really work that way because that's just not how routing works.
One other question, just as we're looking at this, and Janiscu kind of summed it up, but I was thinking this too. Like obviously, like we've simplified things, we've like gotten rid of a lot of boilerplate, but now we've got a long kind of unstructured thing.
Yep.
We could we could refactor that. Like, right? I could say, map to-dos and put those all in a function and like kind of just call each of those separately, right?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And again, I think this is something that we see quite commonly as feedback in the .NET community because of just the history of our framework and how we talk about languages and what the tooling defaults are. Every type is a separate CS file, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think ultimately what we've decided as a framework design team for this is that we want the composition and the organization to be completely up to the user, and they use whatever language features or ever code separation features they want in order to break up their application using minimal in any way they want. We tend to show it all in one file because it's just a good way of communicating lots of stuff. And like, frankly, for me personally, if I had a to-dos app that was this simple, I would just keep it in one file. Like it's a file that is less than 96, it's 96 lines long, and it is my complete application, right? And if I was running it in some type of orchestration container or running it in a cloud provider that did like authentication for me, I used Azure Easy Auth, for example, so I didn't need any auth in here because I don't need to do any user-specific things. It takes care of logging for me because we do default logging, and so it would be configured by the cloud provider or maybe by the orchestration engine like Kubernetes. Those are concepts and concerns that could be dealt with outside of the app, so that because they're handled by the platform the app is running on. That's a pattern that we see more commonly now in things like Azure Functions or any type of orchestrated sort of microservice-y style system, is that some of these cross-cutting concerns are actually taken out of the application code and baked into a layer underneath it. So that's just one example. There are other examples of why you might want to do this. Could just be personal choice. But yes, you can use any C# language feature that you want to organize the code in any way that you want. But ultimately, you have to call this method, and pass in a delegate. That's ultimately what it comes down to. We do not have type initialization, so we will not new up a class for you like we do for controllers and inject things into them. There are examples of people in the community already extending this and building that type of functionality. So they're building
Right.
like a mini framework on top of a mini framework to add the little thing that they like to do in their application.
Yeah. And as far as the people who are looking for like different ways to organize their project, one thing that I would like to point out, which is a thing that I think we have trouble communicating because we're introducing this new host along with these like new map get and map post overloads at the same time. And since we're excited about both, we tend to present them together. These map get and map post functions are just extension methods on endpoint route builder, right? So in your startup class, you can call use endpoints, you can get your endpoint builder, and you can call all these same methods and get all the, new, service injection into parameters into mapget and all that kind of stuff, without necessarily even having to use like the new web application builder. Also, for those of you who might be interested in like using these kind of new features, but want to initialize a class, we have a new public type called request delegate factory that these new like map post overloads use internally, and that gives you even more control. So you have a lot of options kind of how to compose these pieces. It's not all or nothing. You can kind of take the bits you like, but for this community stand-up, Damian showing all the new hotness.
And if you're really advanced and you want to go like full on, you could just look at the source code for request delegate factory and say, I want to invent my own set of conventions for the types of delegates or methods that I want to be able to be turned in and plugged directly into the middleware pipeline, and just copy the code that you want from request delegate factory and make your own. Like, we don't support extensibility that plugs into request delegate factory today with regards to the code generation part, but you could just take the code and do whatever you want. Like that's one of the values of open source, right? Mm-hmm. I would love to see like more little micro frameworks appear. Like we had Carter in the past and Nancy before that, but there were examples of mini frameworks, which Carter still exists and is a fantastic choice for people who want that style. And the whole point of building a framework is that you have a set of opinions that you want to become idioms for how people build or compose the application when they use that framework. That's all a framework really is, right? So ASP.NET Core has a core set of functionality that you can plug on top, and then it has a bunch of frameworks that sit on top of that introduce their own conventions and idioms and extensibility points to change how they work. All we've done here is we've built a new one that sits basically directly on top of routing. That's kind of the way to think about it, which was the work that we did in .NET Core 3 to introduce the concept of routing and endpoints as like a global thing that's in the pipeline. Now, and we plugged MVC into it and et cetera. Now we've kind of built a slight layer on top of that. But then, as Stefan just said, it's also kind of underneath it because of the request delegate factory thing. Like it's kind of a nice gray band that sits just on top of raw middleware that lets you be very expressive about just, here's a method, it has some parameters and returns a thing. Can you just run that when a request comes in, please? That's really what it comes down to. So here's Stefan's point, that this is just an extension method that exists on the endpoint route builder, which is something that's existed in the framework for a few versions now.
Okay. So
I think David's worried we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes left, and he's got a whole...
Yeah, that's fine. We'll get there. I wanted to quickly say also, when we were talking about the routing and what happens when you add a constraint before, is that routing will actually return a 404. So if you, for example, if I had constrained this with int and then I pass foo, the routing system will go, foo is not an int, that route doesn't exist, 404.
Right.
Okay? As opposed to us, we would return a 400 if you got to here. All right. So that's that type of thing. Now I've got a complex type down here. All right. Now, Fowler's like, show all the features. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Like that's why we usually have more than one show, Fowler. It's like saying you do your architecture talk in one show, Fowler. So here we're taking a complex type, but it's not one that's registered in DI. So what do we do by default? This one comes from DI. So the system gives you that from DI. This one, because it's a post, we will automatically try and bind that from the request body, right? We JSON deserialize the request body into this. That's effectively what happens, okay? So now I have a to-do that came from JSON, and I can use that inside here to do whatever I want. Let's see if there's any more examples here. No, I'm going to go back to a different file then to show some of these other ones, or I could just show you in code. Let's do that. Let's write some code. All right. So what Fowler was trying to say, and I'm just going to copy and paste one of these codes and things, and I'll change it as we go. So I'll create this one because I'll use this one. This is one that we've been using. And we'll just take one of these methods. Let's take this one.
So as an aside, with this new builder, the use developer exception page is now there. You don't have to call that anymore.
That's new, right? That's new in,
I think it's preview 7.
In the RC, though, not in preview 7.
Oh, is it really? I think it's preview 7.
I think so.
Oh, okay. I could be wrong.
That's cool. All right, so let's just ignore the squiggles just because I just haven't defined, these types I copied over. What's important is that I have a map post. I've done some things, and we talked about how things are inferred here. Like, yeah, this comes from the body. This comes from services. Stefan mentioned before that you can override that. So you can be explicit. I can say from service here, and then that tells the framework that I want that to come from the service container explicitly, and it'll fail if it can't find it, right? I can also be explicit about what comes from the body, like so.
As opposed to query string or post.
Yeah, and these are familiar to folks who have done this in MVC and Razor pages. It's basically the exact same functionality, but now mapped to kind of this layer. Okay, so you can do that as well to get more control if you don't want things to be automatic all the time. So the other thing is about, well, okay, what does this return? We saw examples of methods that return strings, and then we quickly saw an example of one that returns an object, and I said it JSON serializes. But this one is returning something else. It's calling into this results class, and it's returning the result of calling created. And if I hover over that, you can see that created returns an iResult. So iResult is a new type introduced in ASP.NET Core 6 as part of the minimal API effort. And it's effectively the equivalent of iActionResult from MVC, but pared all the way down to be the bare minimum of what would it mean for a middleware or an endpoint handler to say, I just want to return a thing that you're going to execute on my behalf. That's the easy way to think about it, right? Okay. iResult, if we look at the actual contract for iResult, you'll see it's very simple. So if I return an iResult, what happens? Well, Minimal APIs sees that you returns an iResult. It has a single method on it called execute async, and it takes a context. It looks almost identical to a middleware. All right. A middleware takes in a request and a context and then returns something sometimes by doing something. This is just a formalization of something that we know is going to execute a result based on the fact that we called your method. That's all it really is. So in this case, we have a helper method in the framework that does this for you. You say, hey, doc, in this case, I want to return a status 201 created. So we have a created method that does that for you. It takes in a URI, which will be set as the location header. So you can say, it was created. Here's the location that it was created at. And it can also take in an optional object that we will use to serialize the response body so you can return what was created as well. If anyone has ever used the API controller feature in MVC that we introduced in ASP.NET Core 3, this will probably seem quite familiar because some of these conventions are also part of that system. And then the other thing we can do with this as an extension is we can take a bunch of this metadata with a little bit more help, which I'll show in a second, and we can describe an Open API document or a Swagger document as well about your APIs automatically for you. So for that one, I might actually open the project that does that so we can run it, okay? And we can see that in real time.
Another thing I want to throw out with regards to like the attributes is it doesn't only work on the parameters. If you want to throw like an authorize attribute on your method, that can work. As well as like before with map get with build overloads, you could call, like I think it was require authorization extension method.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Good.
So
okay.
let me
there's been a lot of questions on that.
Go into here. I'm going to go into the minimal API playground. And hopefully it just works when I run it. I didn't break it. It's building. It's thinking really hard.
Yeah, do we blame the streaming for this?
Okay. No, yeah, we may as well. Okay, that's just a warning. That's fine. Yep, it's running. Okay, perfect. So let me take this. We'll go and have a look at what's running here. All right, so I got my hello world, right? And I know that in this thing, if I go to /docs in this app, it takes me to the Swashbuckle front end, okay, the Swagger front end. So I can try out some things. And you can see that we're getting a whole bunch of metadata describing the APIs in my application that is coming through, in this case, to the Swagger UI, or I could go to openapi.json and get it as a Swagger document or an OpenAPI document. So how did I achieve that? How is it that the framework knows, if I look at this post let's do a post to to-dos, and it describes the request body here? Like, how does it know that it takes a request body that looks, has an ID, has a title, is complete, and how does it know that it accepts application.json? Well, that's a combination of two things. It's a combination of our defaults, the conventions. I said before that we just serialize stuff as JSON and we deserialize stuff as JSON by default. So there's that set of defaults. There's what you put on your method. So the method parameters, if I look at this file over here and I go and look at this program.cs, and we look at these parameters, if I find my map post, so here it is, it knows that it takes a to-do. So the framework will describe that automatically. If you add Swashbuckle, Swashbuckle automatically picks up all the metadata that the framework puts in via the API Explorer type. And so we do that on your behalf. But then we can also add other metadata. So we can see down here that not only does it know about the stuff from my type signature, it knows about stuff that I told it. So I said, yeah, and I want you to name this method add to do whenever you describe it somewhere. I want you to know that it can produce a validation problem, which is a certain type of response. And I also want you to know that it can produce a to-do with a status code of 201 created. Okay. And what does that map to? Well, this line here in my example, which I'm using some extra code that doesn't ship in the framework, I'm plugging in a validation library. I'm saying, look, this method can return a validation problem up here. So I tell the framework that that's the case. And then down here, you can see I return created at route. And so down here, I tell it about that case as well. And that's how the framework is able to say, for this method, there are these types of responses. There's a 201, which is the created response, success, and that's going to include the thing that got created. There's the type. But it can also return a bad request with a type of validation problem plus JSON. Okay? And here's what that type will look like. So again, this is possible in MVC today. We introduced support for some of this type of stuff in ASP.NET Core 3 with the API controller and the API controller conventions features. And then you can decorate your action methods with attributes to say, hey, this method produces this type of response, and it returns this kind of type. And then the framework would take all that information, feed it into API Explorer so that frameworks like NSwag and Swashbuckle can produce open API docs. In minimal APIs, it's just more streamlined. That's really what it comes down to. It's a little bit more opinionated, and there's less ceremony involved in doing that description. As Stefan just said before, you could, instead of using the extension methods, you could use the attributes up here instead if you wanted to. You could say producers, right? And here's the attribute from MVC. If you put that on there, it'll work the exact same way as it does by doing it through the extension methods. We let you choose either way. Also, if I'd factored this out into its own method and I passed it as a method group like I did previously, I could also put the attributes on that method and they would still get discovered, and all that would work the way that you expect. So kind of going back to the principle we said before, John, when you said, what if the user wants to structure this differently? Mm-hmm. We support all those ways. You want to put the method on a different type as a static method and put attributes on it, it'll work. You want to pass it as an inline lambda and put attributes on it, it'll work. You want to pass it as an inline lambda and use extension methods to add metadata, that will work, right? All those ways work. Doesn't matter how you want to compose or structure your APIs, you can describe them as well using whatever method fits best with how you chose to put them together. Okay.
We're at a hard stop now because we have another show that's just about to start. So,
okay.
So this is great. We've had tons of great questions. I think obviously we're going to need to come back and go more into this, and especially keep following up as it continues to change, right?
Yeah.
So for people, I've shared the link to your minimal API playground, and then where else is best for people to keep up with this? Just as
So given how much churn is still churn, like we're basically finishing the features in this right now as part of the RC1 release. And so we've got a bunch of folks doing. You can look at the minimal API playground repo that you pointed out to see some examples of how things are landing. I haven't updated this in the last couple of weeks. I need to do that to utilize some of the new features that are coming. You can also look at the ASP.NET Core repo and look at the issues to do with there's like a feature-minimal APIs label. And if you look at those issues and look at the code associated with those issues, you can see the changes live as they're coming in and play with them.
Awesome.
Yeah, there are two labels. There's also feature-minimal hosting.
Yes, for the hosting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll get that from you and I'll add it to our community links for the week.
Awesome.
All right. Well, we've got to wrap up now or the people on the next show will beat me up. So, but thank you so much. This is amazing stuff. And thanks for all the questions today too.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone.